Hi, this is a video about Black people's voices, PAO voices, and how they're tuned out by white society. It's also a shout out, really, to all my fellows that they must make their voices be heard. So, here's the first thing. I'm a PR professional, and one of the most important tools for acquiring understanding between you and your audience is storytelling. So I'm going to tell you a story about me. I'm born in Ghana, and I've been on this mortal coil for over 5 decades. And the first thing about Africans that people in the West don't understand is that we're natural multilinguals. Where I was born, my father comes from one part of the country, my mother comes from another part of the country, and we lived in the capital city, which was a third part of the country. So immediately from the get-go, from day one, I grew up listening to 3 different languages, and there was a fourth. In my household, there was also English. Now, I was extremely fortunate, looking back, that my grandpa was a total fanti-chauvinist. He absolutely insisted, because he'd come from the central region of the country and lived in Accra. He was head of customs and excise for Ghana. He insisted that his language not be lost. So apparently he was my best friend, took me everywhere. And he made sure that I learnt his language, which was Fanti. Now, the first language anybody learns is never lost. Even if you don't use it, it's always kind of there in your hip pocket, and you can play it, as your ace in the hole when you need it. And sure, so I've always spoken my mother's language, actually, my grandfather's language. But today, I sound really weird, which is fair. But it's not weird at all if you understand the time I was born. If you came from a certain kind of African background as the result of the huge colonial project, the idea was to make you sound and behave as much like the former colonial power and its people as possible. That's why I wound up in boarding schools. Prep school in Windermere, big boarding school, secondary school in Bath. As you can imagine, back in those days, in my prep school, I was the only black child. In my secondary school, I was one of, I think, 4 or 5. And the others were, I think I was the poor kid, to be honest, because the Prime Minister of my country had 2 boys there. Haile Selassie had his grandson at my school. Then there was a Gambian kid who was unbelievably bright. I mean, Sam was just spectacularly, I think he went to Cambridge and stuff later on. And there was a Nigerian guy who was fabulously wealthy. I think I saw my first Amiga wristwatch, which he brought to school at the age of about 12. So I was the poor kid, but I held my own. Now, in my prep school, back in those days, everybody had something called the Elocution Lessons. Mine started at age 7.5, 8. By the age of 9, pretty much everybody sounds much of a muchness. Of course, later on, when I came out into society, I realized that the school had created a persona that actually didn't exist in Britain. I sounded like a posh person. Now it's hugely dumbed down because it's just not cool to sound the way I was taught to speak. The inappropriateness, the cultural inappropriateness of my education which I believe cost my parents an absolute fortune, became more and more clear when, after my A-levels, I actually had a place at Edinburgh University, and I was kidnapped by my mum and taken back to Ghana. This because she realized that even though she wanted me to learn the tricks of the white man, the idea wasn't for me to actually become a white man. And she had enough signals to indicate that the kid was getting lost. So I got hoofed off back to Ghana. I loathed it for the first 6 months, 9 months. It was awful. I was ripped away from friends I'd made. We'd all made plans about how we were going to hook up as undergrads and so on and so forth. So I didn't actually realize that I was living the life of Riley in a country where sunshine was guaranteed, where I had a car as an undergrad, where I wasn't short of any creature comforts, while my mates living in England were really slumming it as undergrads. The wisdom of this woman's actions became clear, for it was doing my first degree at the University of Ghana, Legon, that I came face to face with myself, my history, my culture, and even though I knew all about Crécy, Poitiers, and Ajinco, the history of Africa, because actually at the University of Ghana, whatever you were studying, I did business, they wouldn't give you a degree unless you passed a one-year course in African studies. And that was the first time I learned the first thing about Africa. So you guys over here in the UK who know nothing about the colonies that made you rich, that sustained your standard of living, you know nothing about any of that. I got the opportunity to do the remedial education around that. Long story short, what I'm saying is that Africans, by their very nature, we're all multilinguals. I speak 3 Ghanaian languages, one pretty poorly. I get around in French. I speak English. It's not a big deal at all. My sister, one of my sisters spoke Urdu because we lived in Pakistan. We were in diplomatic service. My other sister speaks Hausa, which was the language of the north. In the early part of his career, my father was posted up north, and so he spent time up there, and so she spoke those languages. So my sister speaks 5 African languages fluently, like a native, all of them. So the reason I'm telling this story is to show that we people of African origin are natural multilinguals. We are the last people in the world whose voices should be muted. And yet, white society has a habit of tuning out black voices if they don't hear what they want to hear. And what white society usually wants to hear is a validation that it's treating me well, with decency and respect, when the sad truth is, when your eyes open, you realize that you're being patronized, that society doesn't have a view or vision of you as a leader, as an executive, as a decision maker, as a sovereign person with agency. Now imagine the collision that creates when you give a kid a public school education. I remember in the low 6 when we were doing history, we had a kid there. There were only 6 of us in the class, in an A-level history class, my old school. And somebody used to mumble his answers. So Mr. Cook made him get up and sit right at the back of the class. And he'd ask him a lot of questions. This forced the kid to speak up and express himself. By the time the A-levels came round, he was as articulate as I was, or anybody else was in the class. The point is, in British education, the whole purpose, especially private British education, the whole purpose is to give you the confidence to express yourself, and you see it in Parliament every day. It's the basis of what Boris Johnson does with his people every day. He's been raised to be like that from childhood. And yet this is exactly the thing that white society denies PAO, people of African origin. So the second part of my story is to exhort our people that they must make their voices heard. And the reason they must make their voices heard is that until they tell white society who and what they are and what they experience on a daily basis, white society will say, it's not happening. And all the tactics that are used, you put up a post like this one, it's almost as if white folk, how can I put it? It's as if they've been scalded if they engage with a post like this. It is so, it seems to me, well, that's me on the outside. I mean, I'm not actually experiencing it because I'm not putting forward that behavior. It seems as if they are frightened to the core by the sort of things that I'm saying. And yet, they are realities which are caused often by the behavior of white society. It's like constantly working hard, not wanting to know what your grades are. Ooh, I can't face it. So it's important for our voices to be heard. Now, I'll be frank. There are people, PAO, who can't stand the sound of my voice because dumbed down as it is, I sound like the people who oppress them on a daily basis. And whereas they might be acculturated to dealing with it coming from a face that's white, the idea of it coming from a face that looks like theirs is pretty spooky. There's that. All of these things are learned responses. Then there are the white people. They've been raised to believe that every one of the people who look like Ted is supposed to be my underling. Of course, they're too polite to say that, but it is what it is. And yet he sounds like the posh people, or near enough. I mean, the dissonance in that situation is staggering. I experience this, by the way, every single day. And I speak in front of crowds. I mean, in a TV studio, you can't see the audience. But when you make a presentation, especially even by Zoom, you can see the people working. What the heck is going on? Where's this guy from? And so on. I'll tell you, people like me were created by your nation. The only reason I'm like this is because my country was colonized. It was your idea that I should be here to be educated and sound like you. It was your idea. Not only that, you didn't have plus, and make no mistake, it wasn't for free. We paid for it, the privilege. So I'm actually the natural consequence of British colonialism. And there are many, many more like me. So don't tune me out. It's a bit like saying, okay, I'll have a child and then I'll ignore that child. Or I'll get married to somebody and make sure that I never speak with them. How absurd is that? But that's the absurdity of white society tuning out black voices. And when it comes to talking, speaking up, something I want to say, it's very important. Because I speak a lot of languages, I'm not a linguistics specialist. But two things, actually three things matter when it comes to language. Any language you speak, you've got to get the grammar right. Whether it's pidgin, the grammar's got to be right. If it's patois, the grammar's got to be right. If it's English, the grammar's got to be right. If it's French, the grammar's got to be right. If it's Fanti, the grammar's got to be right. Otherwise, you sound like an ignoramus. That's the only thing you've got to get right. Secondly, nothing gives you more authority than a good lexicon, a good vocabulary. It gives you the latitude to express yourself. Vide Boris Johnson. And in some languages, it's not just the words you've got to know. My language communicates through proverbs. You've got to learn those proverbs and ace them. That's all that counts. So long as you master whatever language it is, forget about the accent. The accent means nothing. There are lots of people who speak with pucker English accents and they talk a lot of bloviating twaddle. Again, vide our Prime Minister Boris Johnson, often. But the most important thing about communication, I can tell you this for nothing, as a PR professional, is authenticity. You know, because people can smell authenticity from a mile off. They can smell a fake from a mile off. You must be you. So this is running on a little bit too long now, so let me close. Talking about black voices. One, I'm telling white society, do not scoot past, tune out, and tell them they don't exist because you created those voices. It's like running away from yourself. One, two. For my fellows, it's time now for you all to speak up. The worst thing, you get these people who, there are colleagues, friends, who were recognized by society, given awards and so on and so forth. What I'm telling them, what they must stop doing is pandering to white society. Because all they do is that they make it much more difficult for us to solve our problems. They do that so that they'll be heard, patted on the back, patted on the head, and validated. But they actually do a lot of damage. For God's sake, do the third thing I was mentioning before. Be authentic. Tell the truth. That's all you can do. And it's all I'm doing in these series of posts. I hope I left some food for thought for you there. Thanks for watching.